Now, with the fall of Kabul in August of 2021 and the Taliban's reinstatement of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, women across the country had to find ways to cope with their lives being turned upside down swiftly and unexpectedly. While the new regime has not directly fired female government employees, it has restricted women from entering the workplaces.
It has been a year since 43-year-old Masouda Sama stepped into her office. On August 15 last year, she rushed home early from work to be with her family after hearing that the then Afghan president had fled the country, paving the way for the Taliban to seize the capital, Kabul. When she went back a few days later, the chaos that followed the takeover, Sama was told she was no longer welcome in the office where she had spent the last 17 years of her life. The Taliban has imposed several limitations on women's freedoms since returning to power. Meanwhile, in the private sector as well, several organizations have reduced the number of female staff, either out of financial crunch, Taliban coercion, or as a precautionary measure to avoid the group's wrath. A study by the International Labour Organization this year has documented a disproportionate drop in women's employment in Afghanistan. The drop reached 16% in the months immediately following the Taliban takeover. In contrast, male employment dropped by 6%. Prior to the Taliban takeover, women made up 22% of the Afghan workforce. While the figure is still dismal, it reflected years of social progress in a deeply patriarchal and conservative society like Afghanistan. While the Afghan economy has severely suffered due to the Western sanctions on the Taliban, women-centric businesses are among the worst affected due to the additional restrictions on women. A recent World Bank survey noted that 42% of women-owned businesses in Afghanistan had temporarily closed, compared with 26% of the firms owned by men.
Thembisa Fakude is Senior Research Fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogues. He contributed a chapter in a recently published book titled Afghanistan, International and Regional Perspectives. It was launched 2 days ago. He joins us now from where it was launched in Istanbul, Turkey. Thembisa, very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. I'm just smiling because I'm thinking about how you were saying the book itself, it was welcomed by the Taliban. So talk to us about those who've read it and their impressions of it.
Well, the various contributors to the book, and my section was about Qatar's diplomacy towards negotiating a return of the Taliban with the United States. So that part was well received, not only by the current administration in Kabul, but also by the foreign minister of Pakistan, who the foreign minister launched the book, amongst others. So it was quite well received. I'm not quite sure whether they understood everything else, or they're still going to go and scrutinize what's inside that book. But the book has been very critical of the Taliban. Unfortunately, we wrote it before, just soon after the return to Kabul, notwithstanding that after that there's been a lot of missteps as far as I'm concerned. The Taliban doesn't seem to be showing interest in terms of true politicking and running the country as it's supposed to be. They've reverted back to their old ways, as we've seen with them being reluctant in allowing girls to go to school. And recently, the shock of them all was last week when the leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was killed in Kabul, apparently hosted by very top leadership of the Taliban. So we're back to square one, unfortunately.
And this is what I want to hear from you, what the view is of pundits, those who've been observing the situation unfold over the past couple of months. We were speaking about the plight of women and girl children. Has Afghanistan at any point, or just generally, gone past being seen as a regional interest and or problem, particularly in terms of some of these ongoing issues? Has the prism through which we see it changed? Because others might argue that these are national issues of, depending where you see it, sovereign country.
Well, nothing has changed, and they haven't changed. They promised that they're going to change. The only thing that they've done now is that they occupy the position of power in some of the most important political platforms in Afghanistan, but they have not moved towards really governing the country. And I doubt if they do have interest nor know-how of how to go by governing the country. The Americans continue to squeeze them. If you remember, there was that $7 billion that was released by Joe Biden. Half of it was supposed to go back to Afghanistan. It's part of the Afghan reserve that the Americans have kept. But unfortunately, because they don't trust the Taliban, the money went to some independent charity organizations with the hope that they were going to distribute the money and use it what it was meant for. So the Taliban hasn't changed its colors. The fact that last week the most wanted person, not only by the Americans but by others in Europe, Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is the leader of the Al-Qaeda and mentor of Osama bin Laden, was hosted by the foreign minister, amongst others, of the Taliban. It means that the Taliban knew exactly where he was all along, and that's quite disappointing. And the fact that they've not even moved towards liberalizing the education system and allowing girls to go back to school, that's also problematic. They are digging their heels and refusing to allow girls to go back to school. Nothing has happened in Kabul. Instead, we have a new insurgents of the ISIL-K, which is the new grouping that has been creating a serious challenge for the Taliban, bombing certain parts of Kabul. So the situation is still the same. It's always 98% shortage of food. People are suffering in Afghanistan, and this is in Kabul. Imagine the rural areas of Afghanistan. So the situation is quite dire, and I don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. They're still insisting on running the country as they used to when they were in opposition to the government, which was led by various people after 2001 when the Americans came in.
As we mentioned at the onset, the title of the book, The Regional and International Perspectives on Afghanistan. I want to understand, have they changed? History has always shown developments in Afghanistan to have some sort of global ramifications. And if you could use the chapter that you wrote to just reflect on that, and specifically if US attitudes or actions have changed around it.
Well, I would have hoped that the Taliban, particularly those that were based in Doha, would have changed, because while they were in Doha for all those years, from 2014, they were exposed to all type of politicking. They met various people, even though it was not public. Most of the meetings they've had were private meetings, but they got a chance to at least learn how to run a nation and how to do diplomacy and proper politics. And to my surprise, when they returned to Kabul, I'm not quite sure whether it's because of the insistence of those who didn't have a chance to go and live in Doha and interact with the world. We were back to square one. That's the first point. And the Americans have insisted that they're not going to deal with the old Taliban that insist on the old ways of doing things, preventing girls from going to school and still supporting Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations in the region. And that, unfortunately, has created some sort of economic stalemate and political stalemate. So they haven't changed, at least according to the Americans. And again, as I've said, that one would have expected that the most influential group that was based in Doha from all those years would have at least come back and insisted on new ways of politics. But unfortunately, we are not seeing that happening. Instead, we're seeing the Taliban going back to its ways, forming alliances and harboring well-known figures that are wanted for crimes against humanity, including Ayman al-Zawahiri, who was killed last week.
And it's very interesting to hear you say what you've just said, because I'm now wondering that, given these recent developments, as you said, what some of the world players and those who are in a position of influence want or don't want, are there those who believe that while the Taliban is certainly not ideal, they are better than any viable alternatives at this stage? And are there any other viable alternatives?
Well, you need to remember that the Taliban, at least this time around, they were not elected. They took power by force, even though they were themselves forced out of power, but this time around there were no elections. We know that the Afghans tried civilian governments, which did not work, started by Hamid Karzai, if you remember, who was very close to the Americans. So nothing has worked. And there are people who believe that, yes, there are alternatives in Afghanistan. But those alternatives, unfortunately, they were also very corrupt. Over the years, when America invested billions of dollars in Afghanistan, we've seen nothing happening. Instead, they were embarrassed when the Taliban walked in unchallenged last year in August and took over power, and basically the troops that were trained by the Americans over the years and American money just abandoned post and allowed the Taliban to walk in through the gates of Kabul and take over power. So it's a very disappointing situation. And I think it will take countries, again, like Qatar and Pakistan, those are neighboring, including Iran, which is now coming in closer to play a role in Afghanistan, because there are thousands of people who are going to the north to look for better opportunities in Iran. They will start playing a role, but I'm not quite sure whether it will be easy to convince the Taliban to abandon their position, particularly the political position that they are currently harboring regarding the West one, and also regarding how to move forward in terms of modernizing the society so that they can open up the country to investment, open up the country to tourism, and to prosperity that comes with educating your people, irrespective of their gender. And unfortunately, at the moment, we don't see that happening. And I'm not quite sure whether we're going to see it happening anytime soon.
So the Taliban have promised all kinds of things in terms of reform on the front of governance and human rights. So if you could just expand a little bit more on what they're harboring in terms of the political agenda and what is plausible. And against that backdrop, do you think the international community desires the Taliban to succeed?
I think they do, but you need to remember that the basic or fundamental political belief of the Taliban is inspired by what's known as the Salafist understanding of Islam, which is a very strict version of Islam. And I think if that doesn't change, you are unlikely to see any political reforms in Islam, because what they harbor is basically what Al-Qaeda, in terms of their fundamental basic political understanding, it's influenced by this very strict form of Islam known as a Salafist understanding of Islam. And until that changes, unfortunately, we are unlikely to see any changes in Afghanistan. You need to remember that the majority of the Taliban and most of the Afghan people also are, to an extent, Salafist, or believe in this strict understanding or interpretation of Islam, and they expect certain things. So the Taliban, one will argue also that perhaps they are caught between the rock and a hard place, that they would like to come up with reforms, but because of this fundamental understanding and interpretation of Islam, which influences their politics, it's difficult for them to move on. And as I've said earlier on, one would have expected that whilst a sizable number of them were based in Doha, and they were mingling and mixing with other people and towards understanding this global new politicking, would have taken that and try and implement it back in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, we don't see that happening. And as I've said, unless there is a change in this fundamental understanding and interpretation of Islam, which influences their politics, I don't see any changes at the moment. Instead, we are likely to see further deterioration of economic conditions in that country.